At just 9 years old, Divine was called a ghost, a curse, and a threat to power. She had no shoes, no home, no voice in a world ruled by men in suits and silence. But one morning, on a dusty cemetery road in the heart of Ouagadougou, fate intervened. A presidential convoy stopped. A child sitting by a grave looked up and changed the future of an entire nation. In a palace built on corruption, secrets, and betrayal, Divine didn't raise her voice. She simply asked a question. One question that exposed millions in stolen funds, unmasked the president's most trusted man, and almost cost her life. Why did President Ibrahim Traoré, a man surrounded by guards, power, and protocol, choose her? Why did this barefoot orphan become the most feared advisor in the country? This is not just a story, this is a mirror, because sometimes the smallest voice speaks the loudest truth. What you're about to hear is a fictional story inspired by real emotions and real struggles, of injustice, silence, courage, and redemption. The characters may not be real, but the questions they raise very much are. The sky over Ouagadougou was still dark when President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the war room. It was 5:46 a.m. The security briefing had dragged on all night. Reports of rebel movements in the north, whispers of unrest in the south, and one too many maps pinned with red X's. His eyes burned with fatigue, but his mind was sharper than ever. A chill hung in the air, strange for a city so used to heat. The morning fog rolled low across the ground like a white snake slithering through the streets. Streetlights cast eerie, golden cones of light, half swallowed by mist. His armored vehicle pulled up. The driver opened the door without a word. Ibrahim climbed in, silently nodding to his guards as the convoy began to roll. They were headed to a public health event in the city's center. Another ribbon cutting, another camera flash, another round of carefully crafted smiles. But Ibrahim wasn't smiling. He sat in silence, eyes fixed on the window. Then something stirred in his chest, a feeling, like a whisper, a push from somewhere deep beyond reason. He leaned forward. "Take the old cemetery road," he said quietly. The driver's hands twitched on the wheel. "Sir? You heard me. Turn at the next left." "But that area's been closed for months. Construction, security. Turn." His tone was flat but final. In the front vehicle, radios crackled. The convoy of black SUVs adjusted course, tires crunching over gravel as they veered off the main boulevard into a forgotten part of the city. The buildings grew older, walls cracked, windows barred, no people in sight. Fog crept heavier here, as if even the air refused to move. And then the road narrowed. Patches of overgrown grass brushed the sides of the vehicles. Ahead, a rusted iron gate stood half open. A broken sign, barely legible through grime, read, "Cimetière des âmes silencieuses," the cemetery of silent souls. The gate groaned as the first car passed. Inside, everything became still. The crunch of tires softened. The radios dimmed. The noise of the city evaporated like breath in cold air. Even the birds seemed to hold their songs. Gravestones stretched out in endless rows like forgotten teeth. Some cracked, some sunk, all pale in the thickening mist. Ibrahim leaned closer to the window. His breath fogged the glass. Something felt off, not wrong, just different, as if the air here remembered things. "Stop," he said suddenly. The brakes hissed. Guards shifted nervously. "Sir, this area isn't secured." "I said stop." His door opened before anyone could argue. Ibrahim stepped out. The fog curled around his ankles like curious fingers. A hush fell over the convoy. He walked slowly along the path between graves. His boots crunched over scattered petals from long-forgotten funerals. The further he went, the thicker the silence became. And then he saw her. A small figure crouched beside a gravestone. Barefoot, her clothes tattered, hair wild, but still, utterly still, like she belonged to this place more than any name carved into stone. She wasn't crying. She wasn't afraid. She was cleaning the grave, quietly, gently, with a torn piece of cloth. Her hands moved as if this was a ritual she'd done 1,000 times. Ibrahim narrowed his eyes. What struck him wasn't her appearance, but her eyes. dark, hollowed by dust and hunger, but alert. Unusually alert, too knowing, too aware for someone so young. "Who's she?" one of the guards whispered. "No idea. She doesn't even flinch. It's like she didn't even notice us. Or maybe she just doesn't care." The president took a step forward, then another. "Young girl," he called softly. She paused. Slowly she looked up. Her face was streaked with dirt, but there was no fear. Only a question, a quiet defiance. The kind of look that says, "I've lost everything. What more can you take?" Ibrahim's heart skipped. Something about that gaze pierced straight through the layers of suits, titles, and power. It was the look of someone who had nothing and yet had seen everything. "What's your name?" he asked. She stood slowly. "Divine." One word, one name, spoken with strength. He glanced at the grave behind her. The stone was cracked but readable. "To our beloved daughter, Divine. Take care of your future." A chill ran through him. He turned to his guards. "Get her in the car." She didn't move when the president approached, didn't flinch, didn't glance sideways, didn't even tense. Her small fingers continued to wipe the dust from the cold surface of the grave, tracing each letter carved into the stone as if they were part of her own skin. The rag in her hand was nothing more than a torn sleeve, soaked in yesterday's rain and today's dirt. Yet she used it like a sacred cloth. President Ibrahim stopped a few steps away and watched in silence. Around him, the guards fanned out cautiously, scanning the area with trained eyes, hands close to their weapons, but the girl paid them no attention. She was somewhere else, in memory, in mourning. After a moment, the president broke the silence. "Who are you visiting?" His voice was gentle, almost uncertain. It was a question meant for someone fragile. The girl finally looked up. Her eyes met his and time paused. There was no fear in them, no awe, just clarity. They were dark, wide, and strangely quiet. The kind of eyes that had cried too much to keep crying. "My parents," she said simply. Her voice was hoarse, almost too soft for the air to carry, but each word landed with a weight beyond her years. She turned back to the grave and placed her small hand flat on the stone, like she was shielding it from something invisible. "Where do you live?" Ibrahim asked, taking a slow step forward. "Here." She nodded toward the ground beside the grave. "I sleep next to them." The president looked down. A piece of cardboard lay curled beside the tombstone, half covered with a threadbare shawl. Nearby, an old metal bowl held crumbs and raindrops. No toys, no shoes, no trace of color in her world. "How old are you?" "Maybe 9, she replied. "I don't remember." He crouched slightly to her level. "What's your name?" She hesitated for the first time. Then, with a strange kind of pride, she answered, "Divine." Ibrahim's eyes flicked back to the gravestone. The inscription read, "To our beloved daughter, Divine, take care of your future." A slow, cold ache gripped his chest. He stared at the words again, as if reading them would change what they meant. Take care of your future. Not a farewell, not a blessing, a plea. He turned back to her. "You've been living here since they died?" She nodded once. "How did they—" He paused, searching for gentler phrasing. "How did it happen?" "There was a fire," she said. Her fingers tightened around the rag in her hand. "At night, I was outside. They were not." She said it like she had repeated that sentence many times. To herself, to no one, to God. A gust of wind swept through the graveyard, rustling dead leaves around their feet. The guards shifted. One of them, clearly unnerved, stepped forward. "Sir, this isn't safe. She might not be normal." Ibrahim glanced at him sharply. "She's a child," he said, his voice suddenly low and edged, "and she's been through enough." The guard fell back ashamed. Then the president turned to his assistant. "Call social welfare." The man hesitated. "Sir, with respect, what if she's dangerous?" "Dangerous." Ibrahim looked back at Divine, who had returned to cleaning the grave. "She's dangerous because she survived? Because she doesn't scream or beg? Because she looks at us like she knows something we don't?" He stood up straight. "She's coming with us. Today." Divine said nothing, but her eyes flickered, just once, with something close to disbelief. Not joy, not relief, just disbelief that someone finally saw her. That night, she sat on the edge of a soft bed in a room she could never have imagined. White walls, warm light, a glass of milk on the nightstand. Her bare feet sank into the carpet. She didn't know what to do with softness. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just sat there, wide awake, the way you do when you're not sure if you're still dreaming or if the world has changed without asking your permission. Outside her window, the presidential palace stood silent under the moonlight. Inside it, something had quietly shifted, and in a room down the hall, President Ibrahim sat at his desk, staring at the same sentence etched on the gravestone. "Take care of your future," he whispered it under his breath, over and over again, as if trying to understand whether those words were written for Divine or for him. The ride back to the palace was unusually quiet. Divine sat alone in the back seat of the second car, sandwiched between two guards who didn't speak to her. She stared out the window, watching the city pass like a dream she didn't quite believe. The road was smoother here, the buildings taller. Everything looked polished, distant, like it belonged to someone else's world. She clutched the small rag she'd used to clean the grave, the only thing familiar in her hands. Inside the lead vehicle, President Ibrahim sat without saying a word. His aides exchanged nervous glances. Taking an orphan off the street wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. There would be questions from the press, whispers among ministers, maybe even rumors of instability. But none of it seemed to bother him. He stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the city. He was seeing her eyes. That gaze, quiet but sharp, wounded but unbroken. It had followed him all the way back from the cemetery and now echoed inside his thoughts. When they arrived at the palace gates, Divine hesitated. She looked up at the massive white walls, the guards in uniforms, the metal that gleamed like it had never seen dust. Her feet itched on the carpeted stairs. One of the staff moved toward her, holding out a towel and clean clothes, but Divine stepped back instinctively, clutching the rag tighter. Ibrahim watched silently, then knelt down to her eye level. "No one here will hurt you," he said softly. "Not while I'm still breathing." She didn't respond, but she didn't move away either. He stood in motion to a housekeeper. "Give her a room near the east wing, somewhere quiet." That evening, while ministers prepared documents and meetings buzzed with the usual rhythm of government, a strange stillness settled in the east corridor. Inside the small room assigned to Divine, the curtains were drawn, the sheets fresh, a small night lamp glowing by the bed. She sat on the edge of it, stiff as a statue. She had bathed, changed into soft cotton pajamas that didn't itch, and combed through her hair for the first time in weeks. But the warmth was unsettling, the silence, too clean, the kindness, foreign. She glanced at the tray on the table, a bowl of warm porridge, bread, a glass of milk. She reached out, touched the spoon, then pulled her hand back as if afraid it would vanish. In the hallway, Ibrahim paused outside her door. Through the thin wood, he could sense her wakefulness, her alert posture, her disbelief. It was a familiar energy, the kind that never fully relaxes, that expects the worst even in the best of places. He knew it well. He'd worn it himself in different ways during his younger years, in exile, in hiding, in battlefields where trust was a luxury. But she was just a child. The thought hit him again and again like waves against stone. A child who had lost everything and still hadn't broken. Later that night, as the palace lights dimmed and even the guards rotated into quieter formation, Divine lay down. She didn't sleep at first. Her eyes wandered around the room, walls without cracks, a ceiling without holes, a bed that didn't sink. She lay still, listening for the kind of noises she was used to. The wind, the footsteps of drunk men, the scrape of rats. But none came. Eventually, her body gave in. Her breathing slowed. The rag she had carried all day slipped from her fingers and fell to the carpet. Down the hall, President Ibrahim stood by the window in his study, looking out over the sleeping city. Papers were scattered on his desk, but for once, he didn't read them. He was thinking about something far heavier than policies or budgets. He was thinking about a name, Divine. He didn't know why he'd stopped that morning, why he'd insisted on that road, why he couldn't walk away from a child cleaning a gravestone with more care than most men cleaned their conscience. All he knew was this, that the moment he saw her, something shifted. She doesn't know it yet, he thought, as the wind gently stirred the curtains, but she's already begun to change everything. The palace smelled like flowers that never wilted and soap that never ran out. Every corner gleamed, floors so clean she could see her reflection, walls so high they seemed to touch the clouds. For Divine, it felt less like a building and more like a storybook castle, except she wasn't the kind of girl who belonged in stories like that. She woke early before the sun, as she always did. Years of sleeping on hard ground had taught her body not to trust comfort. Even though the bed beneath her was soft, her mind stayed alert. For a while she just lay there, staring at the white ceiling above her. No cracks, no dripping rain, no shadows crawling through holes in the wall. Someone knocked gently at the door. A woman in a uniform stepped in and smiled with the kind of kindness that made Divine instantly wary. She was offered a warm cloth to wipe her face, then fresh clothes folded neatly on a chair. Real clothes, not stitched rags or oversized donations. She hesitated, touching the fabric like it might burn her fingers. After dressing, she was guided to the breakfast room. Even the hallway amazed her. Polished floors, giant curtains, chandeliers that looked like glass waterfalls frozen midair. The palace was quiet but not empty. Guards stood like statues along the walls. Maids moved with silent grace, and aides whispered as they passed through. They glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with confusion, but none spoke. She didn't speak either. On the table sat food she hadn't tasted in years. Eggs, fruit, fresh bread, and milk that wasn't sour. She ate slowly at first, unsure if it was meant for her, unsure if someone would snatch it away mid-bite. But no one did. No one even raised their voice. That afternoon, she was taken to a small study room with a kind woman who introduced herself as a tutor. The woman didn't ask about her past, didn't talk down to her. She simply asked Divine if she liked stories. Divine didn't answer, but her eyes drifted to the shelf lined with books. Books were rare where she came from, mostly torn pages, never the whole thing. The tutor opened a book and began to read aloud anyway, and after a few minutes, Divine found herself leaning just a little closer to the voice. By evening, she was back in her room. Another warm meal waited for her, another hot bath if she wanted it, but she didn't touch either. Not because she didn't want them, but because she wasn't sure if they were truly hers, or just a mistake waiting to be corrected. That night, as she sat quietly on the edge of her bed, there was a knock. A deep, gentle voice followed. "Divine, may I come in?" It was him. She stiffened, unsure of what to do. No one had ever asked her permission before. The most powerful man in the country stood on the other side of her door, waiting. "Yes," she said softly. President Ibrahim stepped in with a slow smile, wearing a loose shirt instead of his usual uniform. He looked less like a leader and more like someone's tired uncle. He glanced around the room, then at her. "Is everything all right?" he asked. She nodded. He sat in the armchair by the window, leaving space between them. "I used to sleep with the lights on when I was your age," he said, "not because I was scared of monsters, but because I didn't like the silence." Divine tilted her head. "Why?" "Silence made me think too much. About the things I lost, the people I missed." He paused. "Sometimes silence is louder than noise." She looked down at her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Have you eaten?" he asked. She nodded again. He smiled. "You know, you don't always have to be quiet. It's okay to talk, or to ask, or to say no." She looked up at him, eyes uncertain. "What should I call you?" He raised an eyebrow. "What do you want to call me?" She hesitated, then quietly said, "Mr. President." He chuckled softly. "Too formal. How about something simpler?" His eyes twinkled with mischief. "How about Papa?" The word hung in the air like a balloon waiting to be popped. Divine didn't answer, but she didn't reject it either. That night, before she closed her eyes, she whispered the word to herself. Just once. Not loud, not certain, but real. And as she drifted to sleep, the tightness in her chest loosened, if only a little. She still didn't understand this place. She didn't trust it. Not fully, but for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't cold. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't invisible. The palace was strange, but maybe, just maybe, it was also safe. The palace garden became Divine's secret classroom. Each afternoon after her lessons, she carried a notebook outside and chose the same spot beneath a jacaranda tree whose violet petals fluttered down like silent applause. From there, she could see the arched window of the president's corner office. The glass panes reflected the blue-white sky, but at a certain angle, just right, she could peer inside without being seen. At first, she watched only because the garden felt too perfect, too trimmed, too unlike any place she had known. And that window was the one thing that seemed alive, constantly opening, closing, breathing with hurried footsteps and muffled voices. What she noticed first was the rhythm. Every day at exactly 3 minutes past 2, a tall man with square glasses, Mr. Gerard, the personal assistant, entered the office carrying a brown leather folder, so stuffed its corners curled. He would set it on the president's desk, point to a page, and wait. President Ibrahim rarely looked up from his laptop. He simply reached for a pen, scribbled his signature, flipped, signed again, flipped, signed again. 7 seconds per page. Divine timed it once. When the folder emptied, Gerard gathered the papers into a tidy stack, bowed slightly and left. The ritual never changed. The second thing she noticed was the president's face. She had seen him smile at staff, beam at visitors, soften when he spoke to her. But during the signing ritual, his expression flattened, as though a curtain dropped behind his eyes. It wasn't boredom. It was trust so complete it bordered on blindness. Divine found this both comforting and unsettling. Curiosity bloomed the way vines do, creeping when no one is watching. On the third afternoon, she edged closer, pretending to chase a butterfly, and caught a clearer glimpse. Bold headings, thick black stamps, rows of numbers that marched across the page like soldiers. She couldn't read every word, but she recognized patterns. Approved, transfer, authorization. Her tutor had begun teaching her arithmetic. Numbers now whispered meanings. Why did so many lines end with strings of zeros? Why did the president never slow down? By the 5th day, the ritual felt wrong, like a song stuck on one chord. Divine stopped pretending to chase butterflies. Instead, she sat very still, her notebook open, sketching shapes that resembled Gerard's folder, Ibrahim's pen, the looping flourish of his signature. The more she drew, the heavier her pencil felt, as if each stroke carried the weight of something hidden. That evening over dinner, Ibrahim asked how her lessons were going. She answered politely, multiplication, new words, a poem about rivers. But her mind replayed the sight of stamped pages sliding beneath an uncapped pen. She wanted to ask him why signatures could be given away so easily. But the dining room was crowded with aides and ministers. The question lodged itself in her throat like a stone. The next afternoon, the sky darkened with an early storm. Rain ticked against the office window, streaking the glass and blurring her view. Yet the ritual continued unfazed. Pages slid, pens swooped. Gerard smiled. A flash of lightning illuminated the name of a company she'd never heard. MECA Holdings, followed by a number that made her blink. 3 billion. She mouthed the words the tutor had taught her. Million, billion, impossible. When thunder rolled overhead, Divine felt a different rumble inside her chest. Quiet suspicion. It wasn't anger or fear, not yet. It was a question-forming clause. Who checks the pages before the pen? Why does no one else watch? And what happens to numbers that large once they vanish behind a signature? That night she couldn't sleep. The palace no longer felt entirely safe. It felt too safe, as if its silk curtains might be hiding something with sharp edges. She sat up in bed and stared at the rags she had brought from the cemetery, now washed and folded on her nightstand. It reminded her that dirt can cover anything, stories, graves, even truth. But a small hand with a simple cloth can wipe enough away to read what lies beneath. Divine closed her eyes and pictured the president's looping signature again. In her mind, it no longer looked like a flourish. It looked like a door left wide open. And behind that door, she sensed, were shadows waiting to spill into the light. The next morning, as she followed a maid toward the library, she paused beside the office corridor and traced the air with an invisible pen. 7 seconds, she whispered to herself, just long enough to hide a secret. Then she turned, notebook clutched to her chest, and resolved that the next time she stood near that window, she would not only watch, she would understand. Dinner at the presidential palace was always a quiet affair, formal, orderly, rehearsed. Tonight, however, the long table felt unusually warm. Only a few staff remained. The lights had been dimmed to a golden glow, and the sound of soft utensils clinking against porcelain floated through the dining room like a lullaby. President Ibrahim sat at the head of the table, his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, fatigue softened by familiarity. Divine sat 2 seats to his right, still not used to eating beside a man with a nation on his shoulders. He had asked her how her lessons went, and she responded with one-word answers at first. Good. Yes. Hard. But then, as the soup cooled and her nerves settled, she began describing a story the tutor had read aloud about a bird who built a nest in a lion's mane. Ibrahim listened with curiosity, occasionally asking small questions, smiling more often than speaking. It was one of those rare in-between moments when power forgets its armor and simply becomes human. After dessert, honeyed dates and milk, Divine hesitated. She looked down at her napkin, then up at him. Papa, she began. He raised an eyebrow at the word. She hadn't used it since he suggested it days ago. It landed softly but firmly. Yes, my dear. She fidgeted with the edge of her napkin. Can I ask something strange? He leaned back, folding his arms in mock suspicion. Stranger than a bird living in a lion's hair? She smiled, just a flicker. Maybe, he gestured. Go ahead. She paused again. Then quietly, carefully, she asked, Why don't you read the papers before you sign them? The words seemed to echo slightly, louder than she had meant, heavier than they should have been. The room stilled. Ibrahim blinked once, caught off guard. Then he chuckled, a soft, genuine sound. Oh, that! He waved his hand as if brushing dust off his shoulder. Because I trust the people who prepare them. I have teams, advisors, assistants. I'd never get anything done if I had to read every line. But what if someone hides something? She asked, her tone still gentle but persistent. He gave her a half smile. Have you been watching too many spy cartoons? She didn't laugh. No, Papa. My teacher says we should always read what we sign, even in school, even if it's just a form. The president looked at her more closely now, the humor fading just a little. These aren't school forms, Divine. These are government documents. She tilted her head. But what if the person checking them is the one doing something wrong? There it was, a sentence so simple it peeled something open. He didn't answer right away. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open, then leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, blinking like tired eyes. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. You're right, he said almost to himself. I'll think about that. Divine said nothing more. She resumed sipping her milk, as if she hadn't just nudged the foundation of power. That night, Ibrahim lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the question playing over and over in his mind. He had laughed it off at first, like a father dismissing a child's silly worry. But her eyes weren't silly. They were calm, thoughtful, too old for her face. She hadn't asked with judgment, only with care. What if the person checking is the one doing something wrong? He had signed hundreds of papers over the past months, maybe more. Budgets, transfers, project approvals. Always trusting Gerard, always moving fast. The ink had dried, the deals had closed, and never once had he paused. But tonight, a small voice had paused him. And for the first time in a very long time, President Ibrahim Traoré could not sleep. Morning came with the scent of brewed coffee and polished marble. The palace stirred as usual, maids tending to the halls, guards swapping shifts, advisors preparing for another day of decisions and declarations. But something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, like a quiet tremor before the ground gives way. President Ibrahim Traoré sat behind his wide mahogany desk, a fresh stack of documents laid neatly in front of him. Unlike most mornings, today he was not alone. Across from him sat Gerard, his personal assistant of nearly 6 years, immaculately dressed, sharp glasses perched on his nose, expression neutral but alert. Sir, Gerard began carefully, I already reviewed these files late last night. Everything is standard. Just your signature required. Ibrahim didn't move. Today, he said calmly, we'll go through them together. Gerard blinked. All of them? Ibrahim nodded. Each page. There was a pause, just long enough to register as unease. Then Gerard adjusted his posture and offered a practiced smile. Of course. For the first 10 minutes, it was all routine. Letters of commendation, minor infrastructure updates, small adjustments to education funding. Ibrahim read silently, signing slowly, marking one or two lines with a pencil. Gerard sat upright, his face composed, occasionally interjecting with clarifications that sounded rehearsed. The air between them remained courteous, professional. Then came the folder with the brown tab, slightly thicker, slightly heavier. Ibrahim opened it and immediately narrowed his eyes. Authorization for immediate fund transfer, MECA Holdings, he read aloud. Gerard nodded. New energy initiative, public-private partnership, routine. Ibrahim kept reading. His eyes scanned the next line. 3 billion CFA francs. His pen froze in midair. 3 billion, he said, voice still low but sharper now. Yes, sir, Gerard replied without missing a beat. It's an advance to secure materials before the price hikes next quarter. Ibrahim flipped to the final page of the document. Project lead, Director Jules Koné. Then his brow furrowed. He looked up slowly. Didn't Jules resign in February? Gerard stiffened, barely perceptible, but it was enough. Yes, I believe so, he replied, though the paperwork might have been delayed. The man left 5 months ago, Ibrahim cut in, and this signature looks freshly printed. He picked up the paper, held it to the light. Where did this file originate? Gerard adjusted his collar. It must have come from finance. Call the Minister of Finance, Ibrahim said, standing up. Right now. Gerard hesitated. Sir, perhaps I should... Now. There was no edge in the president's voice, no raised tone, but the command hit like a hammer. Gerard obeyed, retreating quickly out of the office. While waiting, Ibrahim stood by the window, fingers tapping lightly against the glass. His heart was steady, but his mind buzzed. Divine's question replayed in his head like a drumbeat. What if the person checking is the one doing something wrong? 15 minutes later, the finance minister arrived, confused, breathless. Ibrahim handed him the file without a word. The man flipped through the pages, eyes widening. Sir, I've never seen this document before. Your department is listed as the originator. The minister shook his head. We have no file on any contract with MECA Holdings. This company doesn't even exist in our database. Ibrahim leaned back slowly into his chair. The room went very quiet. He turned the paper over once more and stared at the printed signature. Who forged this? No one had the answer. But Ibrahim already knew who had brought the file to his desk. He looked toward the hallway Gerard had disappeared into moments before, and for the first time in years, his trust began to fracture. Not from suspicion, but from something more dangerous. Evidence. He didn't speak again for a long time. His pen lay untouched beside the document. The truth was not in bold letters. It wasn't even hidden. It had been sitting there all along, in plain sight beneath a trusted hand, and a signature he never thought to question. Gerard returned to the office with a nervous smile stretched too thin across his face. He walked in like a man expecting applause but preparing for judgment. The Minister of Finance was still there, holding the forged document as if it were something toxic. President Ibrahim didn't rise to greet him. He didn't even offer a word. He simply gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit. Gerard obeyed. Ibrahim nodded toward the file. Tell me again where this came from. Gerard cleared his throat. As I said earlier, sir, it must have been passed down from finance. We process dozens of documents each day. There could have been a mix-up, someone in their lower offices, someone who forged a signature. Ibrahim interrupted, eyes narrowing. Someone who created a company that doesn't exist? Gerard hesitated. Sir, I never claimed to review every line. My role is to filter, to ensure efficiency. I trusted the departments beneath us. And I trusted you. The words landed with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Gerard looked away, the mask slipping just a little. I need a list of every document you've submitted for signature over the last 3 months, the president continued. Every single file, originals and duplicates. I want a trace on each transaction, every name attached, every address used. Gerard swallowed hard. Sir, with all due respect, that's thousands of pages. The administrative work alone? Then I suggest you start now. The silence that followed was heavy. Gerard's hands trembled as he reached for the folder. Of course, he murmured and stood to leave. But Ibrahim wasn't finished. One more thing, he said, his voice low and sharp. You'll not return to this office unsupervised. From now on, all files go through a full audit team before they ever reach my desk. Gerard stopped in his tracks. His shoulders stiffened. The distance between the door and his dignity had never felt so small. By the next day, the audit began. It started with a room full of documents and a team of trusted legal and financial analysts brought in discreetly under the president's orders. Within hours, discrepancies surfaced. Misleading figures, misused stamps, authorization letters bearing names of officials who had long since resigned. Some files were missing full pages. Others redirected funds to private bank accounts masked under state project codes. None of it had been flagged before. All of it had passed through Gerard. 3 billion CFA was just the beginning. By the end of the third day, the figure had grown to nearly 10 billion CFA, vanished through fake development projects, ghost contractors, and non-existent community programs. The betrayal was systematic, meticulous, hidden behind the very trust Ibrahim had placed in the people closest to him. When the president confronted Gerard with the findings, the man no longer wore his tailored confidence. He was pale, his voice brittle. I didn't take the money, he insisted. I was told these were approved. I was just following routine. I trusted the departments. Maybe some assistants under me. Maybe they tampered. Stop. Ibrahim's voice was quiet, but final. You didn't read what you passed to me. You didn't question what didn't make sense. You signed off on numbers that should have raised alarms. And when you were called to account, you lied. Gerard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. You're dismissed, the president said. It was not shouted. It didn't need to be. The silence that followed carried more weight than fury ever could. By that evening, the palace issued a formal statement. Mr. Gerard Mensah has been relieved of his duties following evidence of gross administrative negligence and suspected collusion in financial misconduct. A full audit is now underway. Across the country, headlines exploded. Talk shows buzzed. Social media filled with questions the public had whispered for months. Why were teachers unpaid? Why were hospitals half-finished? Why did the lights go out in rural towns while money flowed freely into development projects no one had seen? And in the middle of it all, President Ibrahim appeared before cameras, his voice steady. I take responsibility, he said. I signed without reading. I trusted without checking. But someone small reminded me that power without caution invites disaster. He didn't mention Divine by name, not yet. But somewhere inside the palace, a girl in clean clothes and quiet strength sat by a window with her notebook, watching the rain slide down the glass like ink across a page. The press conference was announced with less than 2 hours' notice. Yet the briefing hall inside the presidential palace was already packed with journalists, ministers, camera crews, and curious staff. Rumors had been swirling for days about the fall of Gerard, about the billions uncovered, about the president's unusual silence. Everyone was waiting for answers. No one was prepared for what they were about to hear. President Ibrahim stepped up to the podium without notes. His face was tired but not defeated. He looked out at the sea of microphones and raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady himself. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm and measured. Over the past week, my office has uncovered a series of fraudulent transactions that amount to the theft of public funds. Money meant for schools, clinics, roads. Gone. Hidden behind official documents I signed, documents I didn't read. The room fell silent. Not a camera clicked. Not a breath was wasted. I want to be very clear, he continued. This happened under my watch. I take full responsibility, not just for the signatures, but for the trust I gave too easily, for forgetting one of the first rules of leadership, to question everything, even what looks safe. He paused, then let the next sentence fall like a stone. But the one who reminded me of that was not a minister, not a general, not even a senior advisor. A hush rippled through the room. The one who saved this country's money is a little girl named Divine. Gasps, murmurs, cameras zoomed. Some reporters leaned forward, unsure if they heard correctly. He continued, "She asked me a simple question over dinner, a question I should have asked myself 100 times. Why don't you read before you sign?" It stayed with me. It woke me up. And when I began to look closely, what she feared was true. He stepped back slightly and gestured to the side. The doors opened. Divine appeared in a pale blue dress, hair neatly combed, hands fidgeting by her sides. She walked slowly, uncertainly, toward the podium. The hall seemed to swallow her, so many eyes, so much space. But she kept going until she stood beside the president. Ibrahim placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She didn't need power to speak truth. She didn't need a title to see what others ignored. So today, I'm giving her both. He turned to the cameras. From this day forward, Divine will serve as my special advisor on transparency. Not because she has experience in politics, but because she has what many of us have lost: clarity, honesty, and the courage to ask the right questions. Divine looked up at him, her face a mix of awe and disbelief. Reporters began shouting questions. Is this legal? What does she know about policy? Is this symbolic or real? But the president raised his hand again. You want to know if she's qualified? He asked. She's already proven it. She sees through walls most of us have built. She has nothing to gain, which is exactly why I trust her judgment. The cameras flashed again, this time with urgency. Divine didn't speak that day. She didn't have to. Her presence, her stillness, the way she stood beside the man once considered untouchable, it said enough. Later, back in her room, she sat on the edge of the same soft bed she had feared just weeks ago. The same bed that once felt too good to be hers. Her hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from something she couldn't name. Not pride, not shock. Something quieter. Responsibility. She opened her notebook and flipped past her old drawings of the garden and the president's office. On a fresh page, she wrote just 3 words. Ask, then see. She didn't know everything yet. She was still just a child. But somewhere deep in her chest, she felt it. Not as a burden, but as a promise. Do what's right, no matter who listens, no matter who doesn't. And as the city buzzed with headlines and debate, Divine closed her notebook, exhaled, and whispered to herself, this is just the beginning. The first time Divine walked into a cabinet meeting, the room fell silent. Not out of respect, but confusion. Ministers in crisp suits shuffled their papers, stealing glances as she quietly took a seat beside the president. She didn't speak. She didn't look around. She simply opened her notebook, uncapped a pen, and began to listen. At first, they thought it was symbolic, a show, a publicity stunt designed to soften the president's recent fall from grace. A little girl seated at the highest level of government? It was absurd. Harmless, maybe. Temporary, surely. But she kept showing up. Day after day, meeting after meeting, always early, always silent, always watching. At first, they dismissed her as a distraction. Then they tried ignoring her. Then slowly, they began to feel watched. Because Divine didn't take notes the way most did. She didn't write everything. She wrote selectively, only when a number sounded wrong, when someone spoke too fast, when details didn't line up. Her pencil would pause mid-air when someone hesitated. It would circle a name when a contract was rushed. It would underline a word when the room chose not to. She asked her first question on the 4th day. It was a discussion on a highway project, a multi-million CFA investment into rural infrastructure. The minister responsible spoke confidently, tossing around figures and projected timelines. When he finished, Divine looked up and said, "Why does the contract list 8 schools in Zone B when only 5 exist?" The room went still. The minister blinked. "What?" She repeated her question calmly, with no hint of challenge. "Zone B has 5 schools, not 8. The minister fumbled, muttered something about proposed expansions, but Divine tapped her notebook. "It says completed, not proposed. Did I misunderstand? It wasn't a confrontation. It was precision, software director, and devastating. After that, they started calling her the little shadow that sees all. It began as a joke in hushed hallways, whispered between aides and senior officials. But the name stuck because it felt uncomfortably true. She sat small and still, but her presence was enormous. No one knew how she found her facts, how she remembered dates, names, missing numbers. She didn't interrupt. She didn't grandstand. She simply listened until someone lied, then asked a question that cut straight through the room like a cold wind. And somehow the president backed her every time. "She's thorough," he would say, brushing off concerns. "She's watching us," some muttered uneasily. Within 2 weeks, ministers who once dumped folders on the president's desk began attaching detailed explanations. Memos grew longer. Justifications multiplied. Eyes shifted nervously toward the corner where Divine sat, pen in hand, always waiting, always recording. Some tried to test her. During a budget briefing, a senior advisor casually slipped in a redundant expense line, a transportation subsidy that had already been accounted for in another department. Divine waited until he finished, then raised her hand politely. "Excuse me," she said, "but isn't this the same 210 million CFA listed under logistics last month? It's just in a different column now." The advisor flushed. "Well, it's more of a continuation. Then why is it marked as new?" Again, no anger, just the question. After that, the whispering grew. "Who trained her? Is she spying for someone? She doesn't smile. She doesn't blink. She's just a child. What does she really know?" But that was the problem. She knew enough. She knew when people lied, when they spoke too smoothly, when numbers didn't add up. She had the eyes of someone who had seen more than most grown men, and unlike them, she had nothing to protect. No career to guard, no reputation to maintain, no side deals to preserve. She had nothing except the truth. And truth, when it sits silently beside power, is terrifying. One night after another long meeting ended with awkward silence and shuffling feet, Ibrahim walked with her down the corridor. He smiled gently and asked, "You're not tired of all this yet?" Divine shook her head. "No, Papa. Even if they stare, even if they don't like you." She looked up at him, eyes clear. "I'm not here to be liked." He stopped walking, studied her. "Why are you here then?" Divine answered without hesitation. "To make sure you see what they want you to miss." He let out a long breath and nodded. "Then keep watching." She did. And in the days that followed, she watched more closely than ever, because she had begun to sense what was coming next. When truth makes its home in power, lies will start sharpening their knives. They started whispering long before they started planning. At first it was quiet, half jokes in the corridors, muttered comments behind closed doors. Ministers who used to lean back confidently during briefings now stiffened whenever Divine entered the room. Her questions had begun poking holes in carefully patched lies, and every file, every proposal, every adjusted budget line now risked exposure under her silent scrutiny. "She doesn't even blink when she asks," one man murmured. "She memorized the ministry's last 5 reports," another added, "word for word." "She's not a child," someone whispered. "She's something else." And just like that, the rumors began to twist into something darker. Some claimed she had no real parents, that she'd been found beside a grave because she had crawled out of one, that she didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't age, that she wasn't human but a spirit sent to haunt the palace, sent to destroy them one question at a time. They stopped calling her the little shadow that sees all. Now they called her the ghost in the garden. "She brings bad luck," one official said after a business deal fell through. "She cursed my numbers," another hissed when his project was delayed. "She's not normal," they all agreed, quietly, collectively, dangerously. But fear has a way of turning into desperation, in desperation into action. It was a Thursday when the idea turned deadly. Inside a quiet office at the Ministry of Urban Affairs, a man named Kofi Bato sat slumped behind his polished desk, his hands sweating. 3 of his biggest proposals had been questioned in 1 week. all of them exposed as inflated or fictitious. The president hadn't called him in, not yet, but the silence felt worse. He knew where it had come from. Everyone did. That girl. That girl who had nothing, who said nothing, who saw everything. She has to go, he said aloud, though no one else was in the room. Later that evening, Kofi met with someone he trusted less than his own reflection, but more than the law, a fixer from the outskirts of the capital. The man wore a staff uniform from another district, generic, easy to blend in. His job was simple. During evening tea, Kofi instructed, she always drinks with the president in the garden. A guard sets the tray down and walks away. You have 10 seconds. The man asked no questions. He took the vial, took the payment, and disappeared. That same night, the palace garden was quiet as usual. The sun had dipped just beyond the horizon, casting long shadows across the trimmed hedges and marble paths. Divine sat beneath her favorite tree with a book in her lap, waiting for the tea the president liked to share before dinner. It was one of the only times they sat without papers, without questions. Just calm, almost like family. She had left her notebook inside and remembered it just before the tray arrived. As she stood to go back, her eyes caught a strange movement near the rose bushes. A man, not a guard, not a servant she recognized, was crouched low, too low, holding something small and glass between gloved fingers. He didn't see her at first. She froze, heart pounding. The man reached for the tray, his hand hovering over the cup. Then her voice, sharp and clear, cut through the stillness. "You're not supposed to be here." The man looked up, startled, then terrified. From behind a nearby tree, a guard stepped out with his rifle raised. "Stop right there!" The intruder bolted. He didn't make it far. Within 30 seconds, he was on the ground, pinned and shouting, the vial smashed beside him, the smell of bitter chemicals wafting into the air. Within the hour, under harsh lights and hard questions, the truth spilled out like oil from a cracked drum. The target wasn't the president, it was Divine. When Ibrahim heard, he went silent for a long time. Then he asked only one question. Why her? The answer came with shameful ease. Because she makes us afraid. The evening had fallen gently over the palace, painting the sky in strokes of orange and mauve. The garden glowed under soft lights, its trimmed hedges and marble walkways casting long, clean shadows across the lawn. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace that made people forget that power always has enemies. Divine had just finished her tutoring session when she realized she'd left her notebook under the jacaranda tree, the one near the tea table where she and President Ibrahim often sat at dusk. The book wasn't just for notes. It held her questions, her drawings, her thoughts. It was where she had first written the words that had changed everything. She couldn't leave it behind. The halls were mostly empty as she retraced her steps. The air outside was cooler now, with a slight breeze stirring the petals still scattered on the grass. She walked past the fountain, across the path toward the tree. That's when she saw them. Two figures crouched low in the shadows near the garden table. They weren't guards. Their movements were too nervous, too rushed. One of them held a small vial. The other, wearing gloves, was unscrewing the cap. Divine froze, her breath catching. The tea tray was already set on the marble slab beside the bench. One of the men reached out. It happened before she had time to think. She screamed. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was sharp, pure, like glass breaking. The intruders whipped their heads toward her. One of them dropped the vial, which shattered on the stones. A bitter, chemical scent rose into the air. They panicked. From the far end of the garden, a guard's voice roared, "Stop!" In seconds, shadows turned to motion. Boots pounded. Rifles raised. One man tried to flee through the trees but was tackled. The other slipped on the gravel and landed hard. Within moments, both were pinned to the ground, faces in the dirt, wrists restrained behind their backs. Divine stood frozen. Her scream had faded, but her heartbeat had not. It thundered in her ears, a deafening pulse of shock and realization. She couldn't move. One of the guards approached gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right now," he said. "You're safe." But she didn't feel safe. She felt something else. Violated. As if the garden, the one place she had grown to trust, had been tainted. 10 minutes later, President Ibrahim stormed into the security wing, where the two intruders were being held. He had been in a meeting with foreign delegates when he received the call. He didn't even excuse himself, just stood, turned, and left without a word. Now he stood face to face with the man who had been holding the poison. "Who sent you?" he asked, voice low, dangerous. The man hesitated. One of the guards pressed a baton against his back. "Kofi Bato," the man gasped. "Urban Affairs. He paid us. He said she was ruining everything." Silence. Ibrahim stared at him, expression unreadable. Then he turned slowly to face his aides. "They tried to kill her," he said, almost in disbelief. "They tried to kill a child." The words echoed down the corridor, quiet but thunderous. That night, the palace didn't sleep. Arrests were made. Files were seized. Phones were confiscated. Ibrahim gave only one order that mattered: protect her, day and night, as if she were me. In her room, Divine sat curled beneath the covers, her notebook clutched tightly in her arms. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking. But her eyes stayed wide open, because she now understood something that no textbook could teach. Truth wasn't just powerful, it was dangerous. It had been years since Emmanuel stepped through the gates of the presidential palace. He arrived unannounced, as he always did, swaggering with familiarity, arms open, voice loud enough to fill every room before his feet did. Guards at the entrance hesitated for a moment, then waved him through. His name still meant something. After all, he wasn't just a guest. He was Ibrahim's oldest friend. They'd grown up on the same dusty street, chased the same football, shared the same school books when neither of them could afford their own. When Ibrahim saw him in the doorway of his office, his face lit up with a rare, unguarded joy. "Emmanuel!" he exclaimed, standing from his desk. "My brother!" Emmanuel beamed, arms wide. They embraced tightly, the kind of embrace that forgets time, distance, and title. For a moment, the burdens of power lifted, and Ibrahim laughed like the boy he once was. They sat down. Coffee was brought in. They spoke of old friends, of their mother's cooking, of stupid things they did when they were 14. For a little while, the air was easy, but Emmanuel wasn't there for nostalgia. He leaned forward, fingers tapping the rim of his cup. "I need to ask you something," he said, voice lower now, tighter. "And I don't want a public answer. I want the truth." As your brother Ibrahim's smile faded slightly, sensing the shift. "All right," Emmanuel exhaled, then said, "This girl, Divine." The name landed like a cold wind. "What about her? You made her your advisor?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "A child?" Ibrahim didn't answer right away. He leaned back, folding his hands on his lap. "You've been reading the papers." "I've been watching you," Emmanuel replied. "That's not politics. That's not leadership. That's superstition. It's madness." Ibrahim's eyes narrowed. "Careful." "No," Emmanuel said, shaking his head. "You don't see it, but the whole country is talking. You've let a ghost sit beside you. That girl is not normal, Ibrahim. She's cursed. You found her in a graveyard, and now everything is upside down." The room went still. Ibrahim's voice, when it came, was dangerously calm. "You think she's a mistake?" "I think," Emmanuel said slowly, "you've lost your way. You're letting a child make decisions that affect millions. What does she know about diplomacy? About economics? She barely speaks. She just stares like she sees through you." "She does see through people," Ibrahim replied. "That's the point. She asked what no one else dares to ask." Emmanuel stood up, agitated now. "This isn't about questions. This is about influence. You're being controlled, Ibrahim. Don't you see that? You need to break whatever spell this is." Ibrahim rose too, now eye to eye with the man he once called brother. "There is no spell, only a mirror. And what you see in her, what makes you so uncomfortable, is not magic. It's truth." Emmanuel's jaw clenched. "You're choosing her over everyone who built this with you. Over me." "I'm choosing what's right," Ibrahim said, "even if it comes from the mouth of a child, even if it makes people like you angry." Silence swelled between them, thick with years of loyalty stretched too far. "You're a fool," Emmanuel said finally. "She'll bring your downfall. No, Ibrahim replied, his voice like iron. She'll prevent it. Emmanuel stared at him for a long second. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out. Ibrahim watched him go, a tightness growing in his chest. He hadn't just lost a friend. He'd witnessed the moment a bond cracked into something dangerous. That night, Divine found him sitting alone in the garden, elbows on his knees, eyes dark with something unspoken. "Papa?" she asked. He looked at her, and though he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful, Divine," he said quietly. "Some people fear what they don't understand, and fear makes them reckless." Emmanuel didn't leave the palace that night. He paced the hallway just outside Ibrahim's office, back and forth like a man with too many words lodged in his chest. The guards gave him space. They knew his name, his history, but even they could sense the tension bleeding into the walls. Finally, the doors opened. Ibrahim stepped out, startled to find Emmanuel still there. "You're still here," the president said flatly. "I'm not finished," Emmanuel replied, voice taut. Ibrahim didn't move. "You said enough." Emmanuel stepped closer. "Number I didn't, because if I leave now, I'll be walking away from the only friend I've ever trusted. And I can't do that. Not while you're still blind to what's happening." Ibrahim crossed his arms. "Say what you came to say." Emmanuel's tone hardened. "You used to believe in miracles, in second chances, in the people no one saw. That's what made you different. That's what made you human. And now? Now you fear the truth. You hide behind a child because she says what you want to hear." Ibrahim's jaw tightened. "I listen to her because she sees what no one else does." Emmanuel stepped even closer. "She's not your daughter." The words landed like a slap. "She is mine in every way that matters," Ibrahim said coldly. "No, she isn't," Emmanuel snapped. "She's a ghost of your guilt, a distraction from your failure. You think adopting some broken orphan makes you pure again? It doesn't. You're not a father. You're a president. And you're making decisions with your heart instead of your head. I'd rather lead with heart than follow the silence of men who stopped listening long ago. She's just a child. And you," Ibrahim said, voice rising, "are just a coward in a suit." The air cracked between them. Emmanuel's eyes flashed. "You really believe she's the answer to all this? That she's here to save you?" "She already has," Ibrahim said. Silence fell, the kind of silence that marks the end of something sacred. Then Ibrahim spoke again, voice lowered but sharper than ever. "You look at her and see something unnatural. I look at her and see what's been missing in this place for years. Clarity, conscience, courage." He stepped forward, eyes locked with Emmanuel's. "If you can't see the light she brings, you are the darkness." Emmanuel's face twisted, half shock, half wounded pride. "So that's it? You're casting me out?" "I'm asking you to leave," Ibrahim said, "because I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't think you do either." Emmanuel stood there, chest heaving. He looked around the office, at the paintings on the wall, the bookshelves they once organized together, the chair he'd sat in 1,000 times. And then his gaze fell on the corner of the room where Divine's notebook rested on a polished side table. He turned without a word and walked toward the door. But before leaving, he stopped at the threshold and spoke without turning back. "She'll turn on you one day, just like she's turned you against everyone else." Ibrahim didn't reply. The door closed behind him. And just like that, a friendship of 30 years ended. Not with betrayal, not yet, but with something almost worse. Disbelief turned into resentment. That night, Ibrahim sat alone in his office, lights low, hands folded tightly together. Outside, the wind stirred the trees in the garden. Inside, something colder had begun to grow. He didn't know it yet, but this argument, these words, had not just ended a friendship. They had lit the first match in a fire that would soon come for everything he loved. Night fell hard over Ouagadougou, thick with heat and secrets. In a dim apartment far from the lights of the presidential palace, Emmanuel sat across from a man whose name never appeared in newspapers, but whose influence lingered in every broken contract and silent bribe. The room was sparsely furnished, just a desk, a fan that barely worked, and curtains drawn tight. The only light came from a crooked lamp on the table between them. The official lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "So?" You finally see it too? Emmanuel didn't answer immediately. He stared at the cracked wall as if searching for something to steady him. He had spent hours walking the city after the confrontation with Ibrahim, trying to justify the storm inside him. But by now the decision had already been made. Or maybe it had always been waiting. He nodded once. That girl, the official muttered, she's a problem. A curse, Emmanuel said bitterly. She turned him against everything, against reason, against me. The man leaned forward, smoke curling around his smile. Before she came, we were moving smoothly. Files approved. Projects pushed through. Everyone ate. Now? Now nothing gets signed, Emmanuel snapped. Now he wants transparency. Now every damn paper gets a question from her, a question that kills the deal. The official chuckled darkly. She's not even a real advisor. She's a watchdog in a dress. No, Emmanuel said. She's worse. She's his compass now. And a compass, the man said, tapping ash onto the table, can be broken. Silence. Outside, a dog barked. Somewhere far away, a siren wailed. Then came the words neither man had dared to say aloud until now. No more girl, the official murmured. Emmanuel looked at him, face unreadable. No more man, the official added, his voice like cold steel. We take back control. The weight of that sentence settled between them. It was not just treason, it was murder. High treason against a friend, a president, a child. But Emmanuel didn't flinch. He chose her, he said quietly. He let a child sit where men once stood. He forced my hand. The official leaned back, watching him carefully. You still care about him? Emmanuel hesitated. His throat tightened. He was my brother, he said, but he buried that the day he threw me out. Good, the official said, because once this begins, there's no halfway. Emmanuel didn't respond. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, a rough map of the palace grounds with notes in the margins. Timings, guard rotations, entry points. He slid it across the table. This is how we get in. The official nodded slowly. I'll arrange the men, strangers, no connections to either of us. Emmanuel's voice was low now, almost a whisper. Make it clean, quick, and final. The deal was made in the dark. No signatures, no witnesses, no regrets spoken aloud. Only two men, bound by ambition and resentment, agreeing to wipe the board clean. As they stood to leave, the official put out his cigarette and smiled faintly. Sleep well, Mr. Emmanuel. Tomorrow we begin the end. Emmanuel walked out into the warm night, but the breeze did nothing to cool the fire that now burned in his chest. He looked back once at the apartment window, then disappeared into the shadows. The decision had been made, and in the silence that followed, the fate of a nation began to twist in a direction it might never return from. The night air was thick and unmoving, cloaking the palace gardens in an uneasy stillness. A pair of shadows moved carefully among the hedges, stepping soundlessly across the dewy grass. They wore stolen uniforms, their faces obscured by caps pulled low. In their gloved hands they carried a single vial, colorless, odorless, lethal. They had rehearsed this moment. No words, no mistakes. The tea was always set at the marble table under the jacaranda tree at precisely 8:45 p.m. Divine would often bring her book there just before dinner, sometimes with the president, sometimes alone. It was the only time the garden wasn't watched as tightly. The men reached the tray without incident. But what they hadn't accounted for was the forgotten sketchbook Divine had left behind. Again. As she stepped barefoot onto the stones, clutching a candle lantern in one hand, she froze. Two strangers, bending over the tray, pouring something. Her breath caught. Then she screamed, a sharp, terrified sound that split the silence. The men bolted. One ran into a hedge, the other dropped the vial, shattering it with a faint hiss against the marble. A foul, metallic scent rose into the air. Guards burst from the far end of the garden, rifles raised. Within moments, both intruders were tackled, dragged to the ground, and cuffed. Divine stood trembling, heart pounding against her ribs, eyes wide but unblinking. Inside the palace, chaos erupted. President Ibrahim came running, still in his evening shirt, as security teams swarmed the garden. "Where is she?" he shouted. A guard pointed. Safe, sir. She saw them first. That night, deep in the security wing, the two strangers were interrogated under hot lights and sharp voices. Their silence didn't last long. Under pressure, they broke. It was Minister Kofi and Emmanuel, one of them stammered. They paid us to poison the tea. Said the girl had to go. Ibrahim stared at the man, his face frozen. He barely whispered the name. Emmanuel. Beside him, Divine reached out and took his hand. Small, steady, unafraid. Once again, she had seen what others missed. And once again, she had saved his life. The hallway outside the interrogation room felt colder than it should have. Ibrahim stood in silence, shoulders stiff, staring at nothing. The name still rang in his ears, but it was only one that truly pierced him. Emmanuel. It wasn't just a name. It was childhood, trust, secrets, loyalty, all shattered in an instant. His fingers clenched unconsciously, as if trying to hold on to something that was already gone. His breath came slow, but his chest ached like he'd been struck. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood there, as though turning away would make it real. Then, soft steps behind him, barefoot, familiar. Papa? Divine's voice was quiet. I'm sorry. He turned to her. Her small face looked up at him, eyes gentle and sad, yet stronger than most adults he'd ever known. She didn't ask for anything. She just stood beside him. He knelt down, lowering himself to her eye level. You saved my life, he whispered, barely finding his voice. Again. Divine blinked slowly. That's what family does. For the first time that night, something in him softened. Not the pain, not the anger, but the sharp edge of heartbreak dulled, just enough to breathe. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. They stayed like that for a long time. No more words, no more guards. Just one man finally understanding that sometimes blood doesn't make family, but truth does. And in a palace full of shadows, she had become his only light. The courtroom was packed. Cameras rolled. Millions across Burkina Faso watched, breath held as two men, once powerful, once trusted, stood in chains. The judge read out the charges: conspiracy, attempted murder, treason. Gasps echoed through living rooms. Whispers filled schools, markets, and buses. No one could believe it. Emmanuel, the president's childhood friend, Minister Kofi, the man behind so many national projects, both unmasked as traitors. When the time came for President Ibrahim to speak, the room fell silent. He stood tall behind the podium, calm but resolute. Let this be known, he began, his voice steady. Sometimes your closest companion wears the face of your greatest enemy, and sometimes the smallest voice carries the loudest truth. He paused, then turned to his side. Divine stepped forward, small but fearless. He gently took her hand. From today on, he said, she is not just my advisor. She is my family. The crowd erupted, not with noise, but with silence. A silence of awe, of recognition, of respect. Because in that moment, the nation didn't just see a girl, they saw a symbol, and they knew the future had already begun to change. The courtroom verdict had shocked the nation, but peace didn't follow. Whispers rose again, this time from darker corners. She's not a girl, she's a ghost, claimed a popular radio host. She's a foreign spirit sent to manipulate our president, muttered opposition leaders behind closed doors. Some clerics began preaching warnings. Anonymous posters appeared online. Exile the cursed child. At schools, children repeated their parents' fears, not their own thoughts. Even inside the palace, the atmosphere changed. A few staff no longer greeted her. Some turned their faces away. Divine heard it all. She felt it in the silences, in the stares. She was only 10, but the burden of adult hatred rested on her small shoulders. One day in the garden, a cook's assistant, no older than Divine, muttered, "Why don't you go back to your grave?" Divine didn't flinch. She picked up her book and walked away. But that night, in the safety of her room, her tears soaked her pillow. Still, she didn't ask to leave. She didn't complain. The next morning, she stood beside the president, dressed in soft yellow, notebook in hand, her back straight and her eyes calm. Her presence whispered what her voice never had to say. You cannot silence truth. The attacks grew louder. And so the president answered back, not with anger, but with presence. He announced a public rally in Ouagadougou. People expected soldiers, banners, declarations of war against liars. But what they saw shocked them. A quiet stage, a single microphone, and President Ibrahim Traoré stepping out, holding the hand of a small girl in yellow. The crowd of thousands fell into breathless silence. She is not a ghost, Ibrahim began. She is not a spy, and she is not your enemy. He paused. She is my daughter, and she is the light in this palace. A light that saved your money, a light that saved my life, a light that refused to bend to fear. He turned to Divine, his voice catching slightly. Courage does not come with age. Wisdom does not wear a crown, and love does not ask for permission. He raised her hand gently. This is the bravest person I know. The crowd erupted. Applause, tears, cheers. Phones lit up the sky. Across the nation, hashtags surged. Hashtag we stand with Divine. Hashtag light in the palace. Hashtag daughter of Burkina. Messages poured in from every province. Children sent drawings. Women wept. Men who once doubted now saluted. That day, the shadows began to retreat because the nation had chosen to believe in light. That evening, long after the chants had faded, Divine sat alone by her window. She wore no medals. She gave no speeches. She didn't need to. She simply looked up at the stars, her arms around her knees, and whispered, "Thank you, Mama. Thank you, Papa. I am safe." A soft breeze drifted through the curtains. Somewhere far off, music played on a distant radio. She smiled, not because the world was fixed, but because she now knew she belonged in it. Not as a survivor, not as a burden, but as a light. In the quiet, her voice returned, gentle, almost like a memory. She did not wear a crown. She did not command armies. But her wisdom shook a palace, and her courage saved a president. The girl with the golden heart had not changed the world with power. She had changed it with truth. And sometimes that is all it takes. This story isn't just about a little girl. It's about how truth, even when whispered, can outshine the loudest lies. I'm moved by how Divine stayed kind and strong in the face of fear, betrayal, and hate. Her presence was soft, but her impact was thunderous. It makes me wonder, are we truly listening to the quiet wisdom around us? Your turn. If someone small reached out to tell you the truth, would you be brave enough to hear them? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.